Tonight's reading comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 52 through 59. The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, 'If anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death.' Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may all be seated.
Thank you, Audrey. Well, that's one of my favorite passages, and I was talking with Audrey before we came up tonight. She and I we were walking in here, and she was saying, will we get to that? And I said, I don't know, probably not. But the way I kind of I play it forward, right? This is the verses that you just heard relate to the next section that we're going to be doing on Jesus. So, but it is really a special passage that talks about the authority of Jesus and his eternality in terms of his actual being. So, anyway, we'll get to that one eventually, but not tonight. But I set you up for the long haul. And it is kind of sad, but this will be, next week will be our kind of launch off, and we will. You'll have some time to get your minds back together and be able to think normal again. Well, last time we finished with the ontological argument put forward by Saint Anselm, and the gist of it is, if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived or thought, and you can literally think that God could exist, then God has to exist. And just, it's kind of simple, but it is profound if you think about it. So, at any rate, that I thought maybe you might want to see some of the works of Anselm that are worth looking at. The Monologion is one that talks about 3 different proofs based on the sense of good things reflecting a perfect being. Now, we'll see this a little bit in Thomas Aquinas in a minute, but Anselm is just basically saying that everything that is a good thing reflects a perfect thing. We've talked about this a little bit about Plato and the cave idea as well. The second one is the one that the ontological proof's in this proslogion, and it is God, the explanation of God and the fact that God exists in being, and his existence is based on the reality that all things seem to move toward that being. And then the last thing he did, as I mentioned last week, Cur Deus Homo, which is why God became man, human. And so this is a great book that really talks about the fact that Jesus had to come because we had no way of saving ourselves, and there was nothing that we could do that would earn salvation. In other words, as he develops the argument, the idea is that a perfect God demands perfect justice. Perfect justice demands absolute forgiveness. And that cannot come unless that justice is supplied. And so Jesus is the perfect sacrifice that fulfills that justice. So it's a really nicely done argument. He writes really, really well. So I thought that would be helpful to you to just at least see the names of the books. The person we're going to talk about tonight is Thomas Aquinas. You can see his dates. He's a little bit after Anselm, and he is really considered the greatest theologian produced by the church. St. Augustine was kind of the first big theologian that affected the church history. But St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the really, really great minds. And he wrote a book called the Summa Theologica, which is the summation of all theology. And he literally starts with just the understanding of God and works himself all the way through to the church. And he covers every single doctrine. And he does it in a scholastic tradition, which is you ask a question and then you give answers that are opposing that question. And then you give answers that respond to the questions that are brought against that question. And so it's kind of like Abelard wrote something called sic et non, which is yes and no. But it's like you get the question in front of you, and then you let the people that would normally attack it, you put their position out, and then you come back at that position and you attack those things, and then you sum it up at the end. So that's the scholastic method. And he did this with the whole of theology. It's an incredibly thick work. And I mean by that thick this way, not thick this way. But I'm going to try to use him tonight. And so if you don't understand it, it's my fault. But we'll try to see if we can figure this out. In his speaking about who God is, he came up with 5 proofs of God. And in these proofs, they're kind of summations that they're philosophical in their kind of framework, but they kind of make sense too. And so he has used these. He used these at his time, and they have been followed ever since through the church. So if you go to any group of people and study any group with regard to the existence of God, the 5 proofs of Thomas Aquinas will show up. They just do. And yet he wrote this in the 13th century, and it's still just as powerful today. Now, again, I give you a disclaimer. I may not be able to make it as powerful as he made it, but he understood it, and I'm going to see if I can help you understand it. So the first argument here is called the argument from motion. And I'll put these out so that you can kind of see them as they go. All right, so if you are familiar with the world at all, what you know is that there are things in motion all the time. These motions that take place are always created by something that causes them to start moving. So if something is moving, then there's a something that caused it to move, right? And he talks about the idea that motion, therefore, is a movement from potentiality to actuality. So, for example, something can be moving from cold to hot. It can be cold and has potential to be hot. Or it can be hot and have potential to be cold. Does that make sense? So there's a movement. It cannot be at the same time both actual and potential. So it can't be hot and cold at the same time. Now I know you'll say lukewarm, but the idea is that it cannot be in actuality and potentiality at the same time. So as he talks about this, the mover cannot also be the moved at the same time. The mover is the one that moves that which moves. All right. So, if you begin what he calls an eternal regress or retrogression, you cannot end up with this because you cannot go to infinity. There has to be an original mover of all things. Now, if you think about the way that I would say that you can think about this is, if you believe, as we'll talk a little bit about this later, but if you believe in the idea of the Big Bang Theory, the idea that the universe is expanding in all directions, okay, you cannot retrogress inwardly and just keep going to infinity. Eventually, there is a beginning point for that motion that started. Does that make sense? So he just says, if you go backward far enough, there is a prime mover or a first mover. Even Aristotle argued this same point, that he called him the prime mover. He did not get into who he is. He just said there was a prime mover. So if you had no first mover, then no other movers would have happened. You had to have that first movement that started all other movements, and because of that, you now have the movement that we have today. So if we go backwards, what we end up with is a first mover, and that mover is God. Okay, does that make sense at all? Okay, thank you for humoring me. Okay, the second is probably one we're kind of a little bit more familiar with. This is the argument from efficient cause. Now, I'll go ahead and put the whole of it down on the front, the first slide. In our world that we live in, there are efficient causes. In other words, there is a long line of causes for everything. Everything has an efficient cause that brings it into existence. So I've had a cold. That cold came from germs. There was a cause, and then that germ came from a previous germ, and so forth. There's a cause that brings out each cause, brings out each effect. So there's in life, you can just see that there is no case where a thing is found to be the efficient cause of its own existence. Now again, I'll say this, when Aquinas is talking here, he will come back to this point where he says there cannot be a first, you cannot move yourself, but then ultimately God is the primary mover, okay? In terms of causes, the same thing is true. In our world, it's pretty obvious that lines of causes are going for everything, so that everything has a cause that creates the action. So if there's no reason that you can see a cause that does not have an action in response, it cannot be its own sufficient cause. So he uses it this way. The line of efficient causes cannot extend to infinity. If we remove any cause, it changes all the results. So for any current result to exist, every cause before it has had to happen. So I'm here because of my parents. My parents were there because of their parents, and so forth. You get this cause and efficient cause and effect. If there had been no first cause, then there would have never been a cause that resulted, never been a result, and therefore nothing would have happened. Nothing would have continued. So what he says is if you go in a retrogress, there has to be at least one efficient beginning cause that was not caused by itself. It just existed. And he says that is God. Okay, so far? Okay. The third is what he calls the argument from possibility and necessity. Now, let's see if we can get this one. In nature, we find that things are possible to be and not to be. Okay? And if they become, that is, if they are being, then, and they have the capacity not to be, then there had to be a time in which they did not exist. They had to have been generated. So something else brought them into existence. And that something else will eventually corrupt and break down because anything that could be and becomes, could not be and did not become if it wasn't because of the cause that started it. So it is impossible for these things to have always existed, because it's also possible for them not to be. So at some point they did not exist. Now, his point is, if everything had the potentiality not to be, then at some point nothing would have existed, because their existence was dependent on something else. So if this is true, then nothing would have ever come into existence. You can only come into existence from something that already exists. So when he goes forward from that, so there must be something that is necessary, not contingent or dependent on something else. There has to be something that is not dependent on something else, that began all things that are contingent on other things. Even necessary things must never exist forever, because something else created them. And so therefore it's impossible to go backwards to infinity. So there had to be something that derived its existence from itself, and it is necessary cause of all contingent things. So everything has a contingency. We're all contingent beings. We're dependent on something else. And he's just saying that if you go backwards from that contingency, eventually you come to a non-contingent being, a being that does not need anything to bring it into existence. Okay? Are we good, Sherry? All right. The fourth argument's from degrees of gradation, or some would say perfection. All right, I'll go ahead and throw that. I think I have one more. Okay. In our world, now this one probably makes, this is probably more familiar to you. In our world, we say something is more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, stronger, bigger, you know what I'm saying, better, and so forth. But to say that something is more or less this or that is to say that it is being measured by something that is perfect, or the maximum example of that thing. In other words, it more or less resembles that which implies or exemplifies perfection. So in the idea there would be, I think I said something to this effect. If you think, like, if I look at a painting and I say that that painting is beautiful, okay, what makes it beautiful? In reality, what makes it beautiful? It is the fact that it resembles something that is perfect, called beauty. Now again, if you kind of play with Plato there, and you play with the idea of the cave where there are shadows of existence and so forth, you get the principle of what he was trying to figure out. The idea is that nobility or goodness is only measured when you can have something that is an absolute standard of that measurement. So one of the qualities that you talk about here, truth, nobility, goodness, beautiful, anyway, they're measured by the ultimate perfections of those things. Now, he says also that one of the aspects of perfection is existence. So something has to exist that is the full perfection of all things. And that's what he continues his argument here. That which most perfectly exemplifies a certain quality causes other things to have varying degrees of that quality. So, for example, fire perfectly exemplifies the quality of heat. So if you want to know what heat is, you look at a fire, touch a fire. Well, you shouldn't touch it, but so there's got to be something that perfectly exemplifies the qualities of being, goodness, and existence, along with other perfections. And he says that the personification of all that is perfect is God. So all things are summated in the being of God. The reason that we can know that there's beauty is because God is beauty, and God has given us a glimpse of beauty in our lives, and we're able to see. And so to a degree, you can just say, whenever you see something, you can just sense that there is that reality that makes it what it is. And he is saying that that's based in the person and being of God. All right, the last one is probably the one that most people argue the existence of God with the most. And how he phrases this is things that have no intelligence or consciousness or rational capabilities seem to act towards some end or theological existence. They move towards some end. Things without choice-making capability cannot move toward an end unless they are directed by something else toward that end. So therefore, there must be an intelligent being that directs all natural things, those things that have no brain capacity or mental abilities, to their respective ends. The way that this plays out, I'll give you this. This was a good example when I taught philosophy. I just like this one. He talks about the fact that if you were walking on the beach, somebody actually brought this up recently as they were talking to me and trying to explain something, and it was actually Paley's argument. Paley says, if I was walking on the beach and I came across a watch. Now, I don't know about these computer watches. I can't explain that. But if you had one that had the timepiece where the thing is flipping over and you know what I'm talking about. He said if you came across that and you popped open the cover and you looked into the body of that watch, you would say that just didn't happen. It did not just all suddenly form together like that. There's something there. Okay, so it's kind of that argument that you're looking at, the end result of things looking like they have a kind of a end point without having the mind to create that end point is what he's calling the teleological end. Now, another example of this is this was actually used by a guy named John Flews to try and discount Christianity. He was an atheist for many, many years, one of the top philosophers in culture, and Anthony Flews, and he tried to use this to argue against God, but in reality, he ended up becoming a Christian later, although still a little bit off. But what he said was, if you were in the woods, or let's say a jungle, and there's just chaos everywhere. The jungle is just everywhere. It's just out of control, going in here and there. And you came into a clearing and you found a beautifully lined garden. And so you thought, I wonder how that got there. And so you came back every day trying to find the gardener, just trying to find out how it's got that way, just trying to see. And it never got overrun with weeds. It never got ruined by the jungle itself. It always remained independently beautiful and separate. He said eventually you would come to the understanding there's a hidden gardener that you don't see. And that hidden gardener is taking care of that garden. And so his argument then was that God is that hidden gardener. He is keeping all things in place. And, if we look at Colossians, it talks about the fact that Jesus, the Christ, holds all things together. And so you get that kind of sense of it. I'm sorry, I didn't put the rest of it. This is also the argument of Paul in Romans 1 that we've mentioned already. The idea that there is no excuse for humanity to say that there is no God, because he said God has created this universe in front of us, and the universe has a characteristic finality and endpoint, and it has this sense of organization that just doesn't make sense without having some hidden gardener or some hidden being. But God says, or Paul says, that gardener is not hidden. It's God, and God exists in His creation. And so if we look, we will find Him. All right, so those are the arguments. These are his works. Summa Theologica is a summary of all theology. Summa Contra Gentiles is his summation against the Gentiles. And most people think that he wrote this. This is a book of theology in which he answered every question. But he wrote this, the understanding is he wrote it to try to convert Muslims. This was meant to help them see the truth about God and the existence of all things. So it's written a lot more easy to access than some of the others. All right, now I've added some alternative proofs that I think are interesting ideas, and I've got some things that I'm going to run by you as well that many of you probably have dealt with in the past. So I call these the alternative proofs. The first one is the argument from moral law. All right, so moral law exists in all human beings. That is, when I was teaching, let's see, what was that class? I don't remember what it was. I don't think it was philosophy. Anyway, in the particular class I was teaching, it was talking about the idea that you find morality in every culture. Every culture that we've discovered has morality. The morality may be defined exactly the same way, but mean something different. For example, people ask, maybe it was anthropology, but people ask the question, they come across a culture of cannibals. And they say, okay, well, cannibals obviously don't have a moral code because they eat people. Well, what they discovered was that the cannibals that they discovered, the cannibals did not eat people because people that were not part of their tribes were not considered people. Okay? And because of that, people were their own tribal group. That's the only people that were real people. And so it was not murder. It was like that was some other food source. I know that's weird. But you understand, it's the same argument that's made for abortion. If someone says that is inside that mother's belly, that is not a human being, then it has no value. And culture can say it does not exist as a human, so therefore it is not a human being and has rights. That's why those people who argue against abortion always maintain that at conception life begins. And they maintain that if you don't affect anything or something does not happen in the womb that is a danger to that fetus will become a human without doubt, or will become be born. And so the argument is that that's a human being there. So again, the process here works with regard to this idea of moral law. You find it in all cultures that we've discovered. I'll give you one more example of this, and I know I shouldn't, but it just makes sense. There's a book by a missionary named Richardson, and he talks about the fact that you remember I talked to you about how missionaries see culture as an island, and you try to find the right harbor to go in. Did I not talk about that at some point? Okay. So Richardson went to a culture in which he talked to them about Jesus and the story of Jesus. And when he got to the story of Judas betraying Jesus, they said, these were former headhunters, but he said they just were excited about Judas. They were so excited about Judas, and he could not understand why. It was because as headhunters, they said you fatten people with friendship. And so the greatest satisfaction is when you betray that person and kill them and eat them. Okay? So there was an occasion where the two tribes were facing each other. And about to go to war. And they decided to make peace. And the way that they made peace was they took this child, one of the members of one of the tribes, ran across to the other tribe's group of warriors, grabbed a child and ran back from that other tribe. And then another one ran from their tribe and came and got a child in their tribe and took it back. And he said, "What were y'all doing? What are y'all doing?" He said, "These are the peace children." A peace child is that person that as long as they exist living in that other culture, they will be our friends. And he said, Jesus was the peace child between God and a fallen humanity. And he said, so again, this is kind of off the subject, but the point I'm trying to get across is that culture that has these ideas. They're built on moral value systems that are just there within the system. And it may not look exactly like ours, but it's as true in terms of morality. So, atheistic evolution has no basis for morality. Even if you say it works better for communities not to be at war, the reality is whatever is best for me is all that counts. Survival of the fittest says that whatever I can find that benefits me or mine better is all that's important. And if I choose to be immoral because it gives me what I want, then you can't say that's wrong, because there is no moral value system. So the fact that there is a moral value system in all of us, moral laws tend to imply that there's a lawgiver. And that lawgiver, if we look into the idea of law in general, that lawgiver is God. All right, the second one is the argument from joy. And this was put forward by C.S. Lewis. And really, he wrote, Surprised by Joy was the name of the book he wrote, in which he defined the way that God reached him as an atheist. And what he said was, humans are haunted by questions about the realities beyond the material world. In general, humans try to figure out why it is things exist. That's just within their nature. They want to know why things are. And they are triggered by longings for these deeper experiences of those things. So Augustine says, you've made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in you. So if we've been made for God, there is always going to be within us kind of a restless desire that needs to be fulfilled. And the only one who can fulfill it is God. So he went on to say, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. So a baby feels hunger. Well, there's something called food. A duck feels the desire to swim. Well, there's something called water, and so forth. So if men feel a sexual desire, there's such a thing as sex, and so forth. So he says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for some other world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Rather, it probably means that earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy me, only to arouse me toward the right thing. If you read the book of Job, this is what he is saying. Job is saying, I tried everything, and none of them satisfied me. It's only in God and doing his will that I find happiness and joy. And we kind of, we just did that series on joy, so it's kind of built around that idea. All right, it comes out of Mere Christianity, his chapter on hope, chapter 10. All right, now, this is kind of going back to what we said before. I thought this was interesting, the idea that C.S. Lewis uses here. If there's a persistent reference to God or gods in virtually every culture, why would humans choose to give credit to God in the midst of life being so hard? One of the things that Lewis talks about in the Mere Christianity is this idea that, people began talking about God from the very beginning, and in reality, they did it before we ever had anesthesia, antibiotics, when war was like sticking an axe in somebody's body. I mean, they saw a good and loving God in the midst of a terrible life. And so this idea is that humanity's constant perception tends to make us aware that God has to exist. All right, so from here, I thought it'd be fun to just do this one. Pascal, one of the great mathematicians, Pascal, he wrote a book called Pensées, or Thoughts, and in it, he put forward the question of, should I believe in God or not? So it's kind of like a wager as to whether I should believe in God or not. Now, he says 75% tells me that I should. So here's the way he makes his argument. If I don't believe that God exists, and he doesn't, then I just cease to exist when I die. No harm, no foul. Okay? If I believe that God exists and he doesn't, if I believe that he does exist and he doesn't exist, then at least I've been a moral person throughout my life and a good citizen. Christians are most of the time good citizens. Third, if I don't believe that God exists and he does, then I am separated from him from eternity and must face the possibility of hell. Fourth, if I believe that God exists and he does, then I gain heaven and will live in his presence. So, the issue here is 3 of the 4 are good bets. It would be more a good bet to choose to live for God, just in case, I guess is the kind of the way he puts it. All right. Now, one of the things that people like to talk about in terms of God's existence and so forth is the idea of, why is it that some people can't recognize it or not? How is it that some people are able to kind of just have a better sense of God than others? Some scholars have made the point that our outlook or perspective influences what we see or hear or what we experience. So, if you're in a good attitude, have a good mindset, then you're going to see things in a different way than at other times. And what he says, what some scholars are saying, is that sometimes we just need training in order to be able to find the things that are the most evident to us with regard to spiritual things. So, for example, in Corinthians, the first letter, 2nd chapter, it says that we need a spiritual mindset to understand spiritual things. So, in some senses, what we need to do is to incorporate more effort in learning the Bible, learning the spiritual life, coming closer to God, so that I'm able to perceive spiritual things easier in order to make better arguments as a Christian apologist. One better understands things within a tradition than from outside, when they're inside the tradition, than they do from outside it. So it would be easier for us as Christians to walk into helping others learn about God if we're investing ourselves in the study of God, if that makes sense. All right, so as we go forward, I want to talk about kind of this idea of how people have argued from that fifth argument of Aquinas about the existence of God based on intelligent design. Now, I am not a scientist, as you can already tell, not very good theologian either, but one of the things that people tend to argue is that fifth point of Aquinas, that is, if things that don't move themselves or don't have intelligence act in order, it must be that there's something that ordered them or someone that ordered them. So intelligent design is what others have called ID. Intelligent design is the way that one argues that the existence of God and the existence of His creation makes they tie together. So if you see what the world looks like and the universe operates according to, you will find that God must be behind it. So let me give you some of the things that show up in this area of study. What we're making a comment here is on the idea that things that exist are so complex that they don't seem to make sense to have come into existence on their own. Okay, so in one of the books that I was looking at, the argument's often made that the planet is too complex, the universe is too complex to not have some type of design manufacturer in it. Now, when scientists talk about things like distances in the universe, and I wanted to just kind of put this out here in front of us to kind of just look at it from this idea. When you look at this thing, they try to measure distances in the universe, and one of the ways they do this is what he calls Gillen, the guy I've used a little bit, cosmic distance ladder. The understanding of scientists is that the universe is about 92 billion light years across. Okay, 92 billion light years across. And a light year is 6 trillion miles. Okay, so if light travels at 186,000 miles per second, or 670,616, I can't even say that, miles per hour, what we're talking about are distances beyond the understanding. For example, scientists say that there are existing now galaxies so far away that the light from those galaxies will never actually get to us. I mean, we won't live long enough for those things to exist. So, when we think in terms of these kinds of numbers, the idea of argument for existence and based on intelligent design kind of comes around. Edwin Hubble, y'all know about the Hubble telescope, discovered that the universe is expanding. Now, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but the idea is that it appears that the heat signatures and the light signatures are getting further and further away and dimmer as they go. So that what we're actually seeing is a universe that's in expansion form, as if it started here and went that way. He described it as like shrapnel spreading out from a bomb. So that created this idea of the Big Bang theory that we've all heard about. The idea that the astronomers were trying to say is that there are about 100 to 200 billion galaxies in the universe and 100 to 400 billion suns in our Milky Way alone. And so the assumption has now been is surely there must be life somewhere else, if that's true. Okay? Now again, I'm just trying to give you this kind of big number stuff, right? So if you think of all these numbers, and if you think that there are 100 to 400 billion suns in the Milky Way, the estimation of scientists has been that there's got to be those, what they call LGMs out there, little green men. Okay. There's got to be little green men somewhere. If there's so many of these suns and planets and galaxies. So, for the past 2 decades, planetary astronomers, they've been looking for what are called exoplanets or extraterrestrial planets. They have apparently discovered that there are about 4,300 of these types of planets that seemingly have the properties to support life. But there are 0 planets that have life. Out of the 4,300 that have what appear to be the characteristic things of life that we have here, there are 0 that have life on them. NASA responded about it this way. We have found many Earth-sized rocky exoplanets, some of which are in the habitable zones of their stars. But we, quote, haven't found a single planet that can support life like Earth. So far, our home is unique in the universe. That's from NASA. Now, using something called the Drake equation, okay, I just put the rest of it. Sorry. Okay. Using something called the Drake equation, there are 7 factors that are in this equation that predict the possibility of planets with life. So a team of researchers from Oxford University. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm just reading y'all this stuff, okay? I don't understand it. Just throwing this out. Okay. A team of researchers from Oxford University, where we went not too long ago, using realistic values, said that the chances of having life in our solar system alone is 0.32 zeros. Okay, that's the study with those 7 factors figured in. He gave the 7 factors, but I didn't want to use them. In their report, they concluded that, quote, we find a substantial probability that we are alone in our galaxy, perhaps even in our observable universe. Again, if you're getting the picture I'm trying to say, intelligent design they seem to be making a case to say here, how in the world did humans get here? How's it possible with all these potentialities for it to be this particular place, with this particular sun, with these particular items that create life? All right. Now, as you know, SETI is the search for extraterrestrial life. That was started by Carl Sagan, and you used to probably see him on TV a lot, and another man named Dr. Frank Drake. Gillen says that they've discovered 2 basic reasons why it's virtually impossible to know whether the LGM, whether the LGM actually exists. Okay, these are little green men. Okay. First, because it is hard to define what life actually is. On our planet, all living things are constructed of 6 chemical elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, or CNOPS. Okay. But there are 94 natural elements and 24 synthetic ones. No one knows if a life form could come from any of these other elements. We just don't know. But it's never happened here. Okay. Second, scientists cannot explain how life actually came about on Earth. And this is really critically important. Evolutionary scientists can only talk about what happened after. When they make their arguments, they talk about evolution after the fact. But as I said to you before, nothing from nothing leaves nothing. If there is nothing, there can be nothing. Okay. All right. Some say that it came about on its own. Nothing from nothing. And they speak of other advanced races seeding the planet. You've seen that with Roddenberry. He actually came to the University of Alabama and talked about this, that we are the reason, and you've seen this also on, I can't tell you about the name of it, but there was a movie about where they would walk into a pyramid and go through a thing and go to another universe? Stargate. So anyway, they said that's how this planet, was seeded. Others talk about how life evolved out of the swamp of chemicals in the early days of the planet. The bottom line is those scientists can tell you how life exists. It just does. And it comes out of these chemicals that are here on this planet at this time. So bottom line is, if there is no God, it is incredibly beyond the pale to think that any of this ever happened. There is no chance. Okay, so that's it. That's all I'm talking about. Next week, we will do our last deal on as Jesus as God. Now I'm gonna read. Can I read? Okay, I am not through. One more thing, just one more thing. Okay, I want to read you one more quote from C.S. Lewis, which is so good that it just will be a good setup for next week. Okay, this is said. He said, "I'm so tired of people saying that Jesus was a great moral teacher only." Okay, this is what he says. I am trying here to, this is Mere Christianity, I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Amen. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this time together. Thank you for all the things that we can't understand, but we understand this, that it couldn't happen without you. That your existence is the reason for our existence. And so we thank you that not only is that true, but your existence calls for us to have relationship with you. And we pray that you teach us how to live into that. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.